Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second episode of the Cyber Career Lab. The Cyber Career Lab was created for people who cannot afford thousands of dollars for degree programs or certification training. Our guided lessons expose beginning and intermediate professionals to relevant content that equips them to enter the workforce and grow in their careers. By pairing hour-long engaging sessions with great instructors and guests, we have succeeded in creating a valuable experience for all levels of experience, whether you're thinking about entering the workforce, whether you have a little bit of experience, or you consider yourself a subject matter expert. The Cyber Career Lab really is for everybody, and our weekly lessons, as well as support from the online community, are designed to equip participants to grow in critical cybersecurity knowledge, which helps everybody keep pace with the ever-changing profession. Closing the cybersecurity skills gap is difficult because few organizations focus on equipping early career professionals for success. Many people who want to join the cybersecurity workforce have no idea how to get started, or they just can't afford the cost of learning, degrees, and certifications. Part of the solution to this problem is leveraging the relationships of CLASS-LLC, our friends, our associates, our counterparts, to share as much knowledge as possible to as many people who are interested. For season one, we're focusing on professionalism and perspectives in cybersecurity, and currently we are expanding the discussion about risk management. So last week, our friend Malcolm Harkins helped deliver some great content focusing on risk and cybersecurity perspectives. For this conversation, we're continuing what we started, but focusing exclusively on risk management. According to the news, the monetary damage caused by cybercrime is increasing exponentially. As reported by the FBI at the end of 2020, cybercrime reached losses exceeding $4.2 billion in the United States, and that only includes damages from reported cases. And so if you remove unreported cases from the equation, the numbers are even more staggering when you look at things from a global perspective and from the entire scope of the problem. Important decisions about how organizations manage risk cannot be left to a small group of specialists, but everybody needs to understand risk, what it represents, how it works, and how it is to be addressed for the benefit of the organizations and for the communities that they support. And so in this lesson, our focus is exclusively on risk management in practice, how it works, what you need to know, how you can be successful, and how you can leverage that knowledge to contribute to the organizations that you are working with. Now, when you talk about risk management, there is an essential thing to consider, and that is the definition of risk. And so when we're talking about risk, in a security context, risk is usually some level of uncertainty that is going to lead to a negative consequence or a negative impact. For example, the risk of a data breach has a cost associated with it because regulators levy penalties upon organizations if personal information is accessed or disclosed by people who are not supposed to have access to it. Or there is a risk of the company going out of business if you don't generate enough revenue, if you don't sell enough products. And so risk is always this underlying concept that talks about some level of uncertainty that we have to deal with, and then the outcome or the consequences associated with the situation. When you're talking about risk in a security context, the concept is almost always related to a compromise, to a data breach, to an event, or to an incident that produces a negative outcome for the business. And it becomes very important that businesses understand how to identify the risks that they face, assess and measure them properly, respond properly, monitor the performance, and then communicate the findings to the right people within the organization. What I have as a slide to represent the workflow for risk management comes from the Government Accountability Office that uses a good framework that's easy for a slide presentation so that everybody can see it. But regardless of the type of risk that you're talking about, risk is always going to be the same approach. Step one is always to establish context. When I'm thinking about the risk that the organization faces, am I thinking about the risk for a specific cloud environment, or for a business activity, or for a network segment, for a specific computer system, for the entire organization, or one of the items that's in the news right now is vendor risk management, where the focus of my risk relates to the harm that could be done to my company because of the people that we're working with or because of the access that we give other organizations to our systems, to our services, or to our environment. Once you've identified the context, in an ideal sense, you want to make sure the risk management work that you're doing represents and aligns with the goals and the strategy of the business. So if you work for a business that wants to sell more products because it's going to generate more revenue, the idea is that your security program and your risk management program are going to help the business achieve the outcome that they desire. If you work for a philanthropy organization, a great example of philanthropy was this organization that was called One Laptop Per Child, and their goal was to put a modern laptop in the hands of every child in the developing world. Great outcome that they wanted to produce. The idea that they had in mind was that by providing these devices, children all over the world would grow in knowledge, and then everybody in the world would have greater products, greater services. It would improve economies. It would open up the doors of opportunity to everybody in the world. And so in that context, there is still a risk that people need to be concerned with, where you could have risk that is introduced or some level of uncertainty or some level of compromise simply by not having secure devices or allowing the devices to be the components that distribute malicious software all over the world. And so a part of the process is making sure that your risk management approach is aligned with the goals of the business. But then the next part, and that's what's listed in the workflow, is understanding what risks are you exposed to. Very often your risk is going to come from inside the organization, or it could come from outside the organization. So if you're reading the news, or if you're looking at security content and information, they talk about insider threats. When I'm doing my risk assessment, or before I do my risk assessment, and I'm thinking about the source of risk, the risk could be from disgruntled employees, from uneducated employees who don't understand the security controls and practices that we have in place, or it could be vendors, contractors, or other people working with the organization who have access to accounts, to information, to data, and to other resources. And if any of those are used improperly, it could cause damage or harm to the organization that you're working for. When you look at it from an outsider perspective, sometimes what you encounter is nation state hackers. And so very often you hear things in the news about advanced persistent threat or nation state cyber attackers that come from other countries like China or Russia or Brazil or Sweden or Portugal. And you notice in my explanation that I didn't just focus on 2 countries, because the countries that have the hackers are sometimes receiving support from the government, but other times it's just individuals that happen to be in a specific location. And a component of your risk identification is really digging into what are we dealing with? What are the motivations of the attacker? What is their location? Is it a nation state that is intent on espionage or disrupting national enemies that they have? Or is it corporate espionage, where a threat actor or a bad person in a company or an entire company is organizing its resources to compromise the information and the assets and the trade secrets and the intellectual property of another company? And so it's not always one government is out to get everybody else. Sometimes it is as simple as one company in one location is doing everything that they can to steal as much information as possible because of the economic incentives. You know, other risks that you might encounter could be economic risks, where economic downturn generally increases cybercrime, or the pandemic that we've been dealing with COVID-2 for the last 15, 16, 17 months, depending on how you count, is the source of a lot of cybercrime, because phishing attacks increased by 600% as people were looking for information about COVID-19. I said COVID-2, but SARS-CoV-2 is the clinical name of the virus, but that medical situation drove people to look for information and to be more susceptible to clicking on unsolicited email, to opening the messages, to clicking on the attachments, to looking at the links, and all of these things lead to compromise. Once you have identified the source of the risk, and along with the source, the motivation of the risk of the threat actor who's causing the risk to lead into a problem for your organization, the next step is simply just to conduct a risk assessment. When you're conducting a risk assessment, the objective is to evaluate the capabilities of the threat actor, along with the vulnerabilities that your organization has, the motivation of the threat actor to compromise or exploit the vulnerabilities, which ultimately leads the actor to have access to the environment, which produces the harm that we're concerned about. When you're conducting a risk assessment, your risk assessments can be done qualitatively, using things like low, moderate, or high as measurements that everybody understands, or they can be done quantitatively, where you'll have some kind of formula that helps you generate a result that everybody can use to rank the risks in order of the highest priority to the lowest priority. Now, when you do a quantitative assessment, two approaches generally exist, and for people who are thinking about professional certification like Security Plus or CISSP, understanding the simple mathematics behind conducting your risk analysis is very important. Generally, you want to look at the frequency of an event occurring, and that is combined with the impact for each time the event happens. And so if my event occurring that I'm concerned about is losing a laptop, some number of laptops we expect to lose each year, and we may, based on historical information, expect that we're going to lose 15 laptops per year. And so that identifies what they call a single loss expectancy. Along with that, you want to also identify the monetary losses that you are going to face when that event occurs, and now multiplying, let's say $1,000 per laptop times 15 laptops per year, our annualized loss expectancy becomes $15,000 per year. Now, the question that we want to ask is, based on our risk analysis, what is the best way to respond? Most often when you're dealing with risk management, you have 4 response or treatment options available. You can accept the risk that was identified and do nothing. You can treat the risk by putting some control in place to reduce the likelihood of the event occurring or reduce the impact of the event occurring. You can transfer the risk by buying cyber insurance so that when the event occurs, you don't have to suffer 100% of the losses. It's similar to having car insurance, so that if you have an accident, the insurance company provides funding so that you can restore your vehicle and take care of your health. Your 4th option, after you consider whether you're going to treat the risk or transfer the risk or accept the risk, is simply just to avoid the risk by not performing the business activity. So I can completely eliminate the risk of losing laptops if we don't buy laptops for employees to use. Now the risk has gone away because the business activity that created that risk is no longer being undertaken. What people do within an organization at the leadership level, under ideal circumstances, starting with business leaders, is to think about the benefits and the drawbacks and balance what is the best approach for risk response once they understand the risk. And so the primary function of security professionals, whether you're entry level, intermediate, or advanced, is to contribute to all of the quantitative and qualitative risk analysis that identifies all the threats, all the vulnerabilities, all of the weaknesses within the organization. The information is then packaged in a format that allows you to present it to the business, and then the business stakeholders have the option to choose, based on what is driving the business and their decisions, their mission and their priorities, what is the best way to respond to the risk that has been presented by security. In a lot of cases, the most often selected risk response is to mitigate or reduce the risk by putting some type of control in place. And that's where you hear things like the Nist cybersecurity framework, or ISO 27000 is a framework from the International Organization of Standardization that has an approach for creating a security management system. And along with the security management system, you have a catalog of controls that you can put in place to reduce the risk for the entire organization, not just for a small activity performed by the organization. You also have risk management approaches from Nist. If you're dealing with web applications, or if you're interested in web application security, one solution to reduce your risk for things that are operating on the web is to look at the OWASP top 10. So the Open Web Application Security Project has a list of top 10 vulnerabilities that, when they are addressed properly, drastically reduce the risk for operating web applications. Or if you're focusing on the cloud, because there is a small difference between a web application and cloud services, the Cloud Security Alliance has a collection of controls that are documented in the Cloud Controls Matrix that discusses, describes, and outlines multiple ways to reduce the risk of operating cloud services, so that when you go to Amazon or Google, or if you're using Microsoft Cloud or any of the other services that are available, you have an approach based on the standards that are documented to reduce the risk that the organization is facing. Once you have applied all of the risk treatment, you've selected your response, you've done what the organization has decided is the best practice given their resources and given their motivation to do something, the next step in the process is to monitor risk. Risk monitoring is a very important activity that is often performed by security analysts or risk analysts, people who are at the beginning of their careers up to the intermediate level. Risk monitoring is a good role and responsibility because it provides multiple opportunities to exercise the things that we've talked about. Once I put the controls in place, I need to periodically verify the controls that I've implemented are effective, that they're working as intended, that they're producing the desired result. And in many organizations, you have hundreds of controls. In some cases, you have the same control that is repeated for different applications, where you have the same control that's repeated across multiple departments. And so your understanding and your knowledge of the way that you implement the controls and the way that you assess the controls as part of your risk monitoring becomes very important. Then the output of your risk monitoring goes into communication and reporting. The idea is that everything that you have discovered about ongoing weaknesses or ongoing deficiencies or other things that are going to be a problem for the organization should be documented in a standard format that is reported to the business so that the business can drive additional remediation that needs to take place. The most common way that they talk about the document is it's referred to as a risk register, where the risk register could be something as simple as an Excel file, and on the Excel file, it lists the nature of the risk that was identified, the source, the impact to the organization, the harm that could be done, who owns responsibility for solving the problem, what is the time frame for fixing the problem in terms of days or weeks or months, or in some cases, years. And then a good risk register is often going to also identify how much risk have you reduced by solving the problem, and what is the cost and the level of effort associated with the things that you want to do. And so all of this is going to be documented in your risk reporting that's produced from your risk monitoring. And then you see in the diagram, it goes back to the beginning because risk management is an ongoing life cycle that doesn't stop but continues indefinitely while the organization is operating its systems, its services, and its other activities. Now, the first slide that I highlighted shows a model and an approach for risk management, but you have in Nist 800-39 a tiered approach for the entire organization. What happens in many cases is that many organizations assign all of the responsibility for risk management to a few security people, and then they hope for the best and expect them to do everything. Now, if you look at the data breaches that have happened recently with SolarWinds, with Microsoft, where their Exchange servers were having problems, with Colonial Pipeline, or with any other large organization. Even I can't remember their name right now, but the meat processing company that is based in Australia and has multiple locations in the United States. And each one of these big public data breaches that captures everybody's attention, there was always something that you could look at inside the risk management hierarchy where we could have solved a problem at the right level and prevented everything from happening. The way that Nist lays out a tiered risk management approach is by dividing the organization into 3 levels. At level 1 is where you have the board of directors and the senior leadership team, and the role of those individuals is to define the best practices and the acceptable practices and the amount of risk that the organization is willing to assume or accept to produce its long-term goals and visions. What you generally have at the organization level is a document that is produced by the chief executive officer and the senior leadership team that's called a risk appetite statement, where the risk appetite statement describes in meaningful terms how much risk are we willing to accept to perform certain activities. Now, the organization, when you talk about types of industries and companies, that most often has a risk appetite statement is going to be financial services, because banks, credit unions, organizations that deal in large financial transactions find it risky to not have good practices in place that might lead to fraud and theft of that money. And so they'll have a risk appetite statement that describes a situation whereby we're willing to accept $1,000 worth of losses in a bank at the teller, but anything above that is going to be unacceptable, and that starts to drive the controls that they put in place. Do we put cameras up so that we can watch all of the tellers? Do we hire security guards? All of these sequence of activities, steps, and controls that are implemented have a relationship to the risk appetite statement and the level of risk that an organization is willing to accept. Then when you get down to level 2, building upon the risk appetite statement, the mission and business process level is focusing on all of the divisions or departments that you have within an organization. So if we take a generic organization and say that it's a publicly traded company that has a chief executive officer, the CEO reports to the board of directors, and reporting to the CEO, you have a finance officer, a marketing officer, an operations officer, human resources officer. All of those officer titles that report to the chief executive officer would be the mission and business process level, where every one of those distinct roles has a specific purpose that supports the organization. So the CFO is going to be focused on revenue and how money flows in and out of the business. The CFO is likely going to have accounting information systems and other technology that allows the business processes of financial management to work properly. The same thing then applies to the Chief Human Resources Officer, where onboarding people and providing HR management services, making sure that people have their benefits, that they do their enrollment, that they get paid on time, all of those standard human resources activities use information and information systems to allow the processes to work. And so at level 2, you start to spread across the organization to identify specific missions, specific business processes, things that need to take place. And at this level, you assign the directors of those business units responsible and accountable for doing the security work that was identified at the organization level. In addition, all of the leaders at the mission and business process level are going to provide oversight and manage everything that happens at the information system level, where many of the controls that you see are implemented. So if I have an accounting information system, my cloud controls matrix or my cybersecurity framework or my OWASP top 10 controls are going to actually be applied to the information system in question to make sure that it is protected and to prevent compromises and exploitation of vulnerabilities from the threat actors that we identified in the beginning of the risk management process. The benefit of having this type of approach is that everybody in the company is now involved in risk management. At the top of the organization, where you have the board and the CEO, they define how are we going to operate and what is acceptable and how much risk are we going to assume. At level 2, at the mission and business process level, all of the senior leadership team within the organization takes as input the information that was provided at the organization level and ensures all of those requirements are met within their departments. And then at the system level, where many of our security analysts and engineers in the industry are going to work, all of those requirements are implemented with policies, procedures, standards, guidelines, technical controls, all of the things that produce what we call the CIA triad, which represents confidentiality, integrity, and availability for information and for the systems that process that information. Now, as you move from the framework into specific things that are going to produce good outcomes, the Nist risk management framework is a good approach, and I use the approach in this conversation only because the Nist risk management framework is easy to read. You can download the document by going to csrc.nist.gov and looking up Special Publication 800-39. And within that framework, you'll see a step-by-step sequence of activities that occur to help an organization apply all of the things that I talked about from the tiered organization hierarchy. The prepare step that's in the middle of the wheel is really where you do strategy and governance and leadership, and that the prepare step in the middle is supported by all the items in the gray outer ring of the same color. So the 800-160 talks about security engineering and how you build security into every phase of the development lifecycle. And 800-18 talks about your security program management. 800-30 talks about specific steps that you use to conduct a risk assessment. Or 800-39 is the instructions for using the risk management framework. All of that then supports management and oversight for each of the other activities in the blue ring, where you start by categorizing a system and identifying the level of risk that the system is facing based on the type of information that it has. So if it's healthcare information has a specific level of risk that a hospital or a healthcare provider would understand. Or if it's financial information, banks, financial institutions, or the CFO within an organization is going to assign an acceptable level of risk to the financial information. And so when you think about categorizing an information system, the categorization often has a relationship to the type of information that the system is processing, which then drives the selection of all the security controls that need to be implemented or put in place to protect the information that you have. Now, when we talk about security controls, again, your controls often are going to come from a standard established catalog. The most often used catalogs are going to be the cybersecurity framework from Nist that identifies how you identify, select, detect, respond, and recover to cyber incidents. Or you could use something like the CIS critical security controls, where CIS is the Center for Internet Security, and they have a top 20 critical security controls that should be implemented for cyber defense. Or if you're in a larger organization or a regulated organization, you could use something like the ISO controls catalog, or you could use the HIPAA controls that need to be put in place. The selection of your controls is always going to have a relationship to the type of information that you're using and the mission and business processes required by the organization. Now, selecting controls simply means that you look in the catalog and you pick everything that's relevant and appropriate to meet your needs. Implementation is a defined phase where you take all of the controls that are on paper and you start to acquire those controls by purchasing technology and solutions and managed service provider support and start to put them in place in the organization. Once you have implemented all of the relevant controls from your catalog, the next thing to do is to assess the controls, and assessment in this context is similar to the risk assessments that we're doing or that we started the conversation with. And so when I do my assessment of controls, it is simply a process to verify that the control that I put in place does what it's supposed to do. Is the control there? Does it work properly? Does it produce the outcome that I'm looking for? And the answer to that question is going to vary depending upon the controls that you selected. And so one common control that you see across all of the frameworks that exist is multi-factor authentication. Generally, in most cases, people who are administrative users who have enhanced or elevated privileges on a computer so that they can install software or do something that goes beyond what a normal restricted user could do, most of your security best practices say that you would use two-factor authentication, which might involve a SMS message that you receive or some kind of PIN or code or some other solution to log into the system, or you might use multi-factor authentication, where you have the combination of something that you have, something that you know, and something that you are, also known as biometrics, and you will combine at least two of the three of those to verify the identity of an individual before they can gain access to the system. And so in the assess controls phase, you'll have instructions or processes that you can use to verify that my multi-factor authentication worked. If we use biometrics, does the biometric reader positively identify people, or is there an unacceptable rate of errors that causes us to not have confidence in the fingerprint scanner or the iris scanner or the facial recognition that you're using? Or if we're doing an assessment of our username and password, is the password that people are selecting secure and complicated enough, and does it meet the password policy of the organization? Now, these are just examples of ways that you would assess and evaluate the controls that have been put in place. And once you have assessed all of the controls that are required for a system or for a service or for a department or for the entire organization, a business person is going to review the assessment, declare that they accept the risk that remains after all the controls have been implemented, and then they formally authorize the system to be used to meet the business needs of the company or of the organization. Once you complete the system authorization, the next step is simply to monitor the controls and periodically go back and verify that they continue to be effective, in place, and produce the desired result. And then over time, you want to regularly verify that your categorization is correct, that you've selected the right controls, that you've implemented the right controls, that the controls are working properly, and then periodically the person who authorized the system is going to reauthorize the system. So this represents what's called a life cycle approach, because you repeat the steps periodically over time, but it ensures the greatest opportunity to reduce risk to a level that the business said is acceptable, and then it allows the organization to avoid incidents, data breaches, compromises, or other security harms that everybody cares about. Now, when you're doing this on paper, it could be overwhelming if you've never done risk management before. But the idea that I want to leave you with as we start working towards the middle to the end of the lesson really is that context matters. When you think about all of the work that you're doing, the context of the service that you're applying your risk management work to is going to make a difference, because an application that is on a mobile device is exposed to very different risk than a server that is installed in the data center within an organization, or software on somebody's computer system that they use to perform business activities is going to have very different risk context compared to a piece of paper that's in a filing cabinet, because your security risk is going to apply to digital information and to printed information. And so establishing the context for all of the risk work that you're doing as a prerequisite step is very important. It reinforces the relevance, the significance, and the urgency of all of the activities that are performed in the rest of the workflow or the life cycle. Now, if we move away from computer systems and just talk about risk in a general context, the idea of a bald tire is a great way to conceptualize and think about everything. So with the bald tire example, one of my co-instructors and peers in the industry, Donna Gallagher, came up with a great idea to represent this in a large scale for business executives. The question that you want to ask yourself is, if I have a bald tire, what is the risk that I'm exposed to? most often people are going to have assumptions when you present them information. And so you have to have the list of assumptions. You have to verify are the assumptions valid. You have to make sure that you have the right amount of context so that people are making good decisions and going in the right direction. And so what generally happens is that people assume when you talk about a bald tire, that we're talking about a bald tire on a vehicle. In that context, driving on a bald tire can result in vehicle damage, either because the tire fails or you can't control the vehicle, or you try to stop the vehicle and it doesn't stop because you lose grip. There are all kinds of negative things that are associated with having tires that don't have enough tread left on them, that are not properly inflated, and that can lead to harm, damage, or death. All of this provides context when we're talking about a bald tire. But what if that bald tire wasn't on a car at all? It was a old tire that you had that you used to create a tire swing. And so the risk profile, when we talk about context and the relevance and the impact on the organization, changes drastically when you move a bald tire from a car to a rope that's tied to a tree that you're using as a swing. And so now the asset, the object that is providing value, is still the asset. We still care about the tire. It still does something for us. But the risk of having a bald tire changes drastically with the context because now it's on a swing, not on a vehicle. And so now the fact that it's raining has very different relevance if I have a bald tire on a tire swing versus a bald tire on a car. Or if we're in a blizzard, few people would go outside to swing during a blizzard, but the risk of swinging in a blizzard is very different than the risk of having a bald tire on a vehicle that you have to drive in a blizzard. The other thing that's important to think about when your risk context changes is that your concerns are also going to change with it. And so in our original assumption, if you assume that the bald tire was going to be on a motor vehicle, your greatest risk was the way that you control the vehicle, because there's a relationship between the use of the tire as a resource and the impact that the tire has on the stability and the control of a car. But if the tire is no longer the item that we're concerned about, the tire still has value, but now the greatest concern is the rope that attaches the tire to the tree. Because if the rope is unstable, if it can't support the weight of what we put in the tire swing, if the rope frays and breaks, as you see in this picture, all of our risk context has shifted from the tire to the rope that is holding the tire in place. If you take it even a step further, another part of the context is the location of the tree to which the tire is connected. This is a great way to conceptualize the different risks that you encounter if you're talking about everything that's on the computer systems in my company office versus the information that is in the data center that might be something that the company has versus the risk of information if we put it in the cloud and allowed a third party to manage that data for us. And so throughout this example, the tire was really just an asset, and it is a good visual model for important information that organizations have. If the information is unprotected and is not used properly, it could cause serious damage, but the risk that we're exposed to also changes drastically as the information is moved from one location to another. And so when my information was on a car, it was very dangerous because it was out there, it was unprotected, it could lead to significant harm. When my information ended up being tied to a tree in my backyard doesn't have very much risk. What I'm really concerned about is the way that the tree is connected to the tire, and the rope now becomes a visual or a physical model or representation of access control, or some of the containers or other controls that you would implement from the catalogs that we discussed. For some organizations and for some people, the tree being next to the edge of a cliff is the same experience that they have emotionally when they think about sensitive company data going into a cloud environment where they don't have as much control, Many more people have access to that information if it's not secured properly, and much more significant harm can come to people and to the organization and to its interests if we don't have the right things in place to control access and to protect the information. And so all of this leads to the final idea is that you have to consider how much context matters when you're communicating security risk to the business and to the organizations that you're serving. You can practice this by looking at things around your house or your home or your school and the people that you're working with, and start to put things in the context of resilience, revenue, regulations, and reputation. These 4 R's of risk are often the things that businesses are most concerned about. Resilience represents operations. How does the business operate? How does it use technology to accomplish its goals? What is the ability of that technology to continue operating when there is an unexpected outage or some kind of problem? This leads us into a future lesson that we'll have about business continuity management, business continuity planning, and disaster recovery. But the idea of resilience in this context is, how does risk relate to the operations of the organization and its use of information technology? Another key risk area that people often think about, especially in a business context, is what is the impact of the exploitation of a vulnerability and the likelihood of that happening on the revenue of the company. And so if you take Colonial Pipeline as an example, when they had their ransomware attack, they paid a $4.4 million ransom to get all of their data back. But the pipeline was also offline for a week. And so poor security risk management caused a disruption in the business, and Colonial probably lost much more than $4 million over the days that the pipeline was not pumping gas and fulfilling its distribution requirements compared to the amount of money that they paid in ransom. And so when security people are talking to business people about risk, revenue is often a concern in the back of their mind, and presenting the information in the context where you talk about the impact of something happening on revenue is often going to drive good decisions about the treatment options, and generally leads the business not to just accept risk, but to apply their resources to put some control in place to reduce the possibility that there'll be a disruption in the business, which leads to a disruption in revenue. Another risk area, and this is generally the primary driver when you look at large organizations globally, is regulations. You have regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation, or things like HIPAA, or things like CCPA if you're in California or you're familiar with privacy. All of those regulatory requirements have an impact on an organization, because failing to satisfy your regulatory requirements often has an impact on your revenue and can have an impact on whether or not you can do business whatsoever. And so regulations are often an obligation that you can't get around, that you can't avoid. Is something that you must do. And having a good set of controls in place to ensure that the organization is satisfying regulatory requirements is a very good practice to have. The final note, or the final option, is related to reputation. Now, historically, many people thought that reputation wasn't a big deal. Even for me, when I teach and higher learning, my graduate students once did a project where they looked at the stock price of a company before a breach, immediately after a breach, 90 days after a breach, and then 12 months after a breach. And what we found in a lot of those case studies was that the stock price 12 months after a data breach did not change significantly, and you usually couldn't tell that there was even a data breach if you looked at the financial records over a long period of time. That is a bit of a misconception when you talk about the reputation of an organization, because reputation and security risk have a relationship when it comes to switching costs and some of your other economic factors. So a good example, if we were to compare and contrast, is Equifax. Equifax had a major data breach, and at the time, it affected the largest number of people in the United States for any data breach that had ever occurred. There was a lot of news about it. There was a lot of negative publicity. Entire teams of people were wiped out, and they rehired new staff to come in and clean up the problem, and Equifax's reputation was significantly harmed. But Equifax is one of 3 companies in their industry, and if you're not using Equifax, then you have to use Experian or TransUnion. And from a business to business perspective, when you're talking about organizations that subscribe to the services provided by Equifax, the switching cost is very high, and they don't have the ability to just cancel a contract and move to one of the few providers that are in the marketplace. So unless their contract had a clause that said you can cancel the contract because our company has a data breach, there was really nothing that you can do without penalty or some kind of harm to yourself as a subscriber of Equifax to get out of that relationship. Similar things happen with other companies, but the idea of the cost that it takes to switch from one company to another is very important to consider when you think about the risk to your reputation. At the other end of the scale, if we were talking about a very small organization or an organization where there were a lot of competitors, where switching cost is low, the reputational harm that comes to the organization because of poor management, because of negative publicity, because of a cyber incident that harms customers or the industry or the world, very often consumers are going to switch to another provider so that they don't have to be bothered. And so if I had 50 companies in an industry, if one company has a data breach or a cyber incident that causes reputational harm, most people are going to choose one of the other 49 companies that are left in that industry. And so in this context, again, because context matters, the reputation does make a difference, because reputation is a reflection of the confidence that organizations and consumers have in your ability to protect data and information and the customers who are doing business with them. At this point, we have about 10 minutes left. Really briefly, I'll open the floor for questions. If you have any, feel free to post your question in the chat. We use Microsoft Teams on purpose so that everybody can engage. Or if there are no questions, feel free to use Discord as a tool to post something that you think about later. So myself or somebody from the team will be happy to jump in, provide feedback, and make sure that you're pointed in the right direction. All right, so I see no questions from the audience. What I ask as a set of next steps is that you just share this program with other people. As I said in the opening, the reason that we're doing this is to expose the greatest number of people possible to the opportunities that exist by becoming cybersecurity professionals. If you did it any other way, there's going to be a high cost to get a security certification, or it's going to take a lot of time and money to get a degree in cybersecurity. But in 4 easy steps, you can grow in the knowledge that you need to be successful and to get your first job, or if you've already got your first job, to move up, because we're exploring important topics from a new perspective. And so 1, I encourage you to join the Cyber Career Lab community on Discord. As the community grows and more activity takes place, it is going to be a great opportunity for collaborative learning for everybody who's involved. 2, remember to come back and sign up and schedule your participation in the weekly sessions. We do a new session each week, but we work in a process whereby we're not spamming you and giving you unsolicited email. You generally want to come back and register each week for the Tuesday session so that you're opting into the lessons and you're choosing to be part of what we have available. Step 3 is to either participate live, and thank you to those of you who joined us live, or go back and listen to the recording by joining the YouTube channel and keeping up with the sessions that are provided. And step 4, for those who are willing and able, education and experience are the greatest barriers to entry for people at the beginning of their careers, and those who can afford it. The donations that you make to the Cyber Career Lab expand the opportunity and the reach that we have to provide this information, the education, and the resources that people need to join the profession, to be successful, to move up in their careers, and to contribute positively to the cybersecurity ecosystem. If this is your first time here, I thank you for joining us. If you have been here before, I thank you for coming back. The last thing that I would ask of you is to just share this opportunity with other people who are your friends, your family, or in your network. The more people who participate, the more robust and the more valuable this content is going to be for everybody involved. On behalf of Cyber Leadership and Strategy Solutions, I thank you for your time and attention today. I thank you for what you'll contribute to the Discord channel. Thank you very much for sharing. Have a great afternoon.